Hi, welcome to the special edition of The Daily, which is an extended and in-depth response to the critics who, in my humble opinion, have completely overhyped and oversold the movie Captain America Civil War. We've been led to believe that this is the best movie since sliced bread. I just don't think that's accurate at all. And so this episode is a response and an in-depth look at the movie as to what I think the major structural flaws and problems are with this movie and why these flaws are serious enough to really challenge the glowing praise that certain reviewers and critics have heaped upon this movie. Obviously, this episode is going to contain spoilers, so if you haven't already seen the movie and you don't want to hear or see any spoilers, then you're going to want to shut this off right now, go and watch the film, and then come back later. If you don't mind spoilers or you've already seen it, then great, welcome aboard. I think that's all I really want to say, so fasten your seatbelt, make sure that your tray table is returned to its upright position, and let's get this review started. Okay, so let me start with a little bit of background. First of all, I went to this film with my brother and another mutual friend of ours, Jace, and my brother and I have quite divergent views and obviously strong opinions on movies, but we're often quite divergent. So those of you who've seen my in-depth response to the criticisms of Batman v Superman, my brother and I went to see that movie together as well, and he disagreed with a lot of what I said in that extended review. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it, my response to the critics and the criticisms of Batman v Superman, because I thought it was a good movie. Now, he didn't agree with me on that. However, last night when we watched Captain America Winter Soldier together, by the end of that movie, we were in agreement on just about every point about what was wrong with this movie. So that gave me a sense that I wasn't just imagining things in my head and that I wasn't just being hypercritical or looking for problems with this film because I went in not liking it. And not only that, but since posting on social media about this, other people who I know who are Marvel fans have responded, and they've basically echoed and issued the same sentiments, or a lot of the same sentiments, or even new sentiments that are negative about this film. So I know I'm not just making this up. I know I'm not just being hypercritical, because when I got to the end of the movie, I thought maybe I was. Maybe my expectations were wrong, or maybe I was just being unfair of this movie. But it's quickly become apparent to me that there are actually a lot of people who can see the flaws in this particular film. Now, this movie for me was really disappointing because I went into this movie, I purposely didn't read a lot about this movie, but I watched a couple of short movie review shows that were non-spoilers, that people who had seen the movie and talked about it being a good movie. I read a couple of reviews and they really praised the film. And so I went into this movie thinking that I was going to see a film that maybe I might not have liked everything about, but because of the praise that I had heard people heaping on this film, I thought to myself, this movie is going to be better than Winter Soldier, which I think is the standard for Marvel's best movie so far. It is the best movie they've made so far in the MCU. I thought it was going to be better than Winter Soldier, or at least it was going to be as good or maybe close to Winter Soldier. Even if I didn't like everything, it was going to be on par with Winter Soldier. It really wasn't. I got to the end of this film and two things. I was really disappointed and I was kind of surprised, actually. I was a bit dumbstruck. I couldn't believe, getting to the end of this film, that it had failed to live up to the claims that I'd heard made about this movie. Now, to be fair, this is not simply a case of someone who went into a movie and had overhyped it in their mind. I didn't go in with a lot of expectations, and I went in thinking I'm trying to go in with a blank slate and give myself as little information as I can and as little outside influence. I just said, read a couple of reviews and that was it. But and even when you account for the fact that reviewing is a highly subjective thing, and critics are going to have their own tastes about what they do and don't like about a movie, and you're not always going to agree with critics. Putting that aside, there's just no way that you can justify the claim that I've read from some critics who are saying that this is the best superhero movie that's been made in several years. I completely disagree with that claim. Secondly, the claim that this is the best movie that Marvel has ever made, I've read that in more than one review. Completely untrue. This is not the best movie that Marvel has ever made. I don't even think it's in the top 3. It doesn't even hold a candle to Captain America Winter Soldier. So for me, this was a really disappointing experience because I expected more of this film, and I was kind of hoping for more. And as I said, I thought at the very least that this would be an experience similar to The Winter Soldier, even if it was a little bit overinflated in the hype department. I didn't expect to come out of it just going, what the heck happened there? Why did this simply not even come close to the critical comments that I've heard about this movie? In fact, my brother, who is a Marvel fan, as I said, who often disagrees with me, one of the first things he said when the credits rolled and the movie was over was, he said, these movies are actually kind of starting to get a bit boring now. And it's interesting because I've got another episode coming up where I talk about this, where I actually believe Marvel is very close to hitting its critical mass for the number of movies that it's producing. I think they're starting to hit their critical mass because they have turned us movie goers into consumers. They've made too many movies and they are continuing to make too many films, and that's starting to stifle creativity, and it's meaning that we're starting to get a bit formulaic, and I think the audience sooner or later is going to get fed up with that formula. So I was kind of surprised and interested, based on that episode of The Daily that I've got coming up, to hear my brother, without having talked to him about it at all, saying one of his first comments after the movie was, these movies are starting to get a little bit boring. Okay, so the very first thing I want to challenge about this film is the inaccuracy of its title. It's called Captain America Civil War, but this isn't really a movie primarily about Captain America. Instead, this is really a movie. Some are suggesting it's about the Avengers. I actually think this is an Iron Man, Tony Stark movie. Tony Stark is the main protagonist or antagonist, depending on which side of the debate, I guess, you fall. But it's really about his internal struggle and realizing that struggle and his own personal demons and everything else. This really is an Iron Man movie. I could be convinced that perhaps it's more of an Avengers movie because there is an ensemble cast and there are obviously a lot of other characters who do play a major role in this film. But it is whatever you think it is, whether it's Iron Man or Avengers, this is definitely not a Captain America movie. It's just not. He is not, unlike Captain America Winter Soldier, which I think is still Marvel's best film. Captain America's Winter Soldier was a tight character piece that really focused in on and kept us tracking Captain America's struggles and Captain America's story, and it was all centered around his character development, and the struggles and the issues he was facing. This movie doesn't do that. Captain America is a player, and he is obviously a major player. He's certainly mentioned as one of the sort of key figures here, but realistically, it's really Tony Stark that we're following in this movie. And because of that, I've actually proposed some alternative titles for this movie. So here goes. Iron Man 4, The Avengers, Looking Pensive and Talking Serious, Iron Man, Midlife Crisis, Iron Man, Just Call Me Bruce Wayne, The Avengers, Governance and Responsibility, The Avengers, Finding Zemo, The Avengers, Winter Soldier 2, Revenge of Sokovia. Because this movie basically is about all of those things, but Captain America is, I don't even know if he's really a vehicle. He is, I suppose he is. He's kind of a vehicle to tell those other stories, but it's really not his story. So the title of this movie is really quite misleading. One of the big glaring structural things for me about this movie was the inconsistent tone, and there's two ways that this movie is inconsistent. So in a movie, it's not unusual to have tonal shifts in a film, but those shifts should sort of be organic and they should really flow. There should be a progression, a natural progression, and they should flow out of that. In this movie, the film keeps shifting tones, and quite markedly so. So, for example, probably the first half of the film, before we get to that airport fight with all of the Avengers fighting each other at the airport, the tone is dark, it's somber, it's a dark and brooding sort of film. We get to the airport fight, and all of a sudden, the tone has shifted. This is now a lighter movie. It's more of the typical Avengers, Marvel-style action tone that we're used to. And interestingly, I think it's actually some of the best parts of this film, because this film is not all bad. Don't get me wrong, I don't think this is a terrible movie. I think there is the bones of a good film there, but there are some major flaws there that really let the film down. Despite that, there are some moments of excellence, and I think that runway fight was actually an engaging sort of part of the movie for us as audience members. It introduced obviously Spider-Man and Ant-Man into the Avengers mix, and it also gave us something that's a bit lighter, and it felt there was something about that scene that was just better than other parts of the movie. But then as soon as that's over, we shift back into this dark, morose, brooding movie again, and then it climaxes at the very end with this really brutal, dark, and with Iron Man basically having turned full psycho and gone into full revenge mode, and the tone, it was kind of jarring for me. And not only that, but there's individual characters, like the obvious one is Tony Stark. His tone as a character in this film shifts quite dramatically from one part of the movie, and then it changes again by the end. And it's not a sign of good writing, I don't think, when that's happened. So what happens is, for the first part of this movie, Tony Stark he's really dark, he's really brooding. Then there is the scene where he goes to recruit Peter Parker, to recruit Spider-Man to the cause. Now that scene, once again, is another really good piece of excellence in a movie that has some pretty big problems, I think. And it's a great scene, there's lots of creativity on display, and what is it? All of a sudden, Tony Stark is back to that usual sort of quipping Tony Stark. There's a little bit of physical comedy in there as well. It's a great interplay between these two characters. It's well written. There's a really engaging and, I think, enjoyable sort of tone to it. But then as soon as that's over, Tony Stark goes back to being morose, dark, brooding, and he finishes the film in full psycho mode. Now, this is made even more problematic by the fact that throughout the rest of the film, his whole shtick in this movie is all about we must maintain control, and we must have good order, and we must come under good authority and good governance, and that's why he wants to sign the UN Accords, right? But by the end of the film, the final act, he has completely given that all away, and he goes into full, unfettered revenge mode, where he has absolutely lost control. He is as far from the guy at the beginning of the film at the end of the film, he's as far away from what he was at the beginning as really as possible. And it just, now, even if you are not consciously aware of it and not taking in what is going on, your brain subconsciously knows that these inconsistencies are there, and it doesn't help you because it doesn't actually feed the dramatic tension that should be there for any story to really grip you and grab you and carry you along with it. And in fact, what it does is effectively it keeps pulling you in and out of the drama. It keeps, I guess, pulling the rug out from under you, even if you're not consciously aware of what's going on. And the tonal shifts in this movie were really, really glaring and very, very obvious. Another big thing I noticed about the movie was there's writing inconsistencies now starting to creep in. So they're not major, but I think they are big enough definitely to notice. So one of the big ones in this film is, I think Captain America and Tony Stark have basically reversed roles for this movie. Because if you think about the Avengers and what we know about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, of all of the Avengers we've been presented so far in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the one character who is probably least likely to obey the rules and to submit himself to government oversight is who? Tony Stark. He is the one character that is most likely, in fact, in Avengers Age of Ultron, he's the guy who's basically breaking the rules, acting as a lone wolf, and his actions create a massive problem for the Avengers, right? He's the guy who is originally a government's weapons contractor and has seen the worst and nastiest side of governments and walks away from that and does his own thing because he doesn't want to be tied up and caught up in that world anymore. And yet here he is in this movie. He's the guy who is now saying, yep, we should respect the system, we should submit, we should stop being freelancers, we should stop doing our own thing. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Meanwhile, Captain America, who I think is probably one of the characters in the Avengers who is more likely to actually say that we should trust the system and trust the government, is the one guy who was saying, no, we shouldn't. And so there's this major shift in these characters as they have already been established previously in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that kind of is quite jarring when you get to this movie. The other thing as well is things like Vision. In Avengers Age of Ultron, by the end of that movie, Vision is effectively this godlike superhero. I remember at the end of that film thinking, man, how are they going to play this out in future movies? This is really interesting because Vision is just so powerful, and he could effectively destroy the Avengers and everyone else in a heartbeat without even blinking an eye. And so I thought this is a really interesting premise they've created here, and it'd be great to see how this is going to be resolved in future movies. In fact, when Vision is first created in Avengers Age of Ultron, the other Avengers are suspicious of him at first. They think he might be a threat. And it's not until he picks up Thor's hammer that they realise he has a purity of intention and that they can actually trust this guy. Yet in this movie, it just seems that his powers are completely diminished now, and he is, with no explanation in the film, he's now fighting other Avengers, and they are footing it with him. You know, Avengers who he should be beating are actually engaging with him, and he's sort of just one of the gang. Now, someone suggested to me that maybe, you know, he had set his phases on stun. So in other words, he wasn't going full throttle because he didn't want to harm the Avengers. Well, that should have been written into the movie. If that's what's going on, and I can understand that's maybe what they're trying to do, but that's poor writing not to have given us some sort of context or subtext or something to actually explain that that's what's going on. But it doesn't happen. Another thing that's like that is Scarlet Witch. In Avengers Age of Ultron, she has mind control powers and she uses them on Tony Stark. Right? She's able to show him things. She's able to manipulate his mind and other characters obviously as well. Why the heck then is she not using that power? It's just completely ignored in this film. Why is she not using that power when she actually needs to influence the outcome for the good? She just doesn't use it. It's almost like they either forgot or they thought, we'll just pretend that's not there because, you know, we're trying to push this movie in a different direction. So these sorts of things, they are structural flaws. And as I said, the big one for me was Captain America and Iron Man, I think, have really reversed roles. And it didn't kind of make a lot of sense based on what they've already established in the MCU. Okay, so some of the other structural issues with this movie are that the pacing is terrible in places in this film. The first third to a half of this movie, there's just too much talking. There is just too much talking. Now, I understand you need expository dialogue, and I understand that a movie can't just be 180 miles an hour, full-on adrenaline rush. Movies like that are very seldom good, right? So you've got to have expository dialogue, you've got to have people talking. But this movie, that just felt like there was too much of that sort of stuff and too much talking, and I don't think it was done very well at all. And it's kind of frustrating because the Russo brothers are actually renowned for writing good dialogue. And you go and look at Captain America Winter Soldier, and that is a great example of a movie that's well crafted and that just moves at a good clip. But this one doesn't. It stalls in places. I remember at one point thinking to myself, about a third of the way through the movie, I just remember thinking to myself as I'm watching this film, I'm kind of a bit removed from this movie. It's just not engaging me very well at all. In fact, I could get up, walk out of the theatre, and I wouldn't be too bothered. And I'm normally the sort of person who has got to stick around and see a movie, even ones that aren't particularly good, because I've got to know what's going on. But in this film, there was a point to about a third of the way through where I was thinking, I'm just not into this film that much. I could literally get up, walk away, and I would not at all in the slightest be bothered by the fact that I walked away right now. That's not a good sign. That is a sign that there are some problems with the writing. In fact, by the end of the film, the talking got to the point where by the final act of this movie, I was in my head, I was just thinking, shut up. Stop telling us the drama. Show us the drama. Give us acting, give us looks on faces, give us scenes, give us concepts, give us something, give us indirect comments, but don't give us yet more dialogue and talking about dramatic things. Show it to us. This is a movie. And it was just, by the end of it, it was really, really, really frustrating. The other thing that was really noticeable that's a structural problem with this film is The initial action scenes at the start of this film, they are not very well filmed and edited. And it was really, really noticeable. In fact, I said to the guys I was with, who I watched the movie with, I said, to me, it felt like they had two different directors, two different editors, and two different cinematographers or cameramen working on this movie. Because by the end of the movie, the action cinematography has got a whole lot better, and the editing is much better as well. It's actually watchable. You can follow what's happening. The action is being tracked well. There is a lot more fixed camera work. But the initial stuff, it's handheld and I mean, shaky cam, it is just too shaky. And the edits are so frenetic, and they don't really follow the proper screen lines that where your eyes are actually sort of following. Even if cuts are quick, your eyes can follow the action if the camera leads you to a place and then the next cut starts at that point and then leads you on from there. But the cuts in this movie are not like. In fact, there were points at which the way the camera is tracking, there was a fight involving Black Widow at one point, and I remember thinking to myself, the way the camera tracked her movements, I was like, the physics of this, they don't kind of make sense because of the way you're tracking it. It's like, what's going on? And secondly, the momentum is completely taken out of this fight. It was almost like it was still happening at fast pace, but it was all in another way. It sort of felt like it was sort of slow-mo because the camera tracking was kind of off. And as I said, just too frenetic. The editing and the cuts were not good, and it's really, really jarring. Those initial action scenes in this movie, they are not actually very watchable at all, and it's really, really noticeable. Thankfully, by the end of the film, they have completely changed tact. My friend Jace, who was there, who is a bit of a cameraman himself, he said to me, I wonder what actually necessitated or caused them to make that change, because clearly the change has been made, and thankfully so, because by the end of the film you actually are able to track the action a lot better. Even though it's frenetic, the edits are better, and the camera movements and the way they follow the actors is a lot better and a lot more fixed camera work. But like he said at the time, I wonder what it was that actually caused them to make that change, because it is really glaring and problematic. And it kind of made me wonder, why didn't they go back and reshoot those original action scenes? Why did they not edit this better? Was it rushed, or did no one notice? And if no one noticed, if a movie's being rushed, that's one thing. They didn't have time to go back and take pickup shots and everything else, or they didn't have time to fix it in editing. Okay, that's one thing. But it's another thing if they just put this out and no one either noticed or cared about this massive structural problem with the movie. That's not a particularly good sign. One of the more troubling aspects of this movie, I think, and the reason it's more troubling, is because this is not the first time this has happened in a Marvel movie. In fact, by my count, this is the third major incident where this particular problem has arisen. And that is the fact that this movie, once again, Marvel completely fails to handle the villain and the character of the villain and the role of the villain in the story. It is not handled well at all. In fact, it is a completely wasted opportunity. We saw the same thing in Iron Man 3 with the way they took the Mandarin and completely destroyed that character, I think, in my opinion. And most people who responded and reviewed that film have talked about the fact that Mandarin is this completely redundant non-villain, who is just a space filler, really. And then the guy who was really behind the scenes, we're given a bit of an Incredibles animated movie type plot. That's really the villainous plot in that film. It's not a very strong or convincing villain that's operating behind him either. In this movie, we've got the exact same problems. You don't need Zemo at all in this movie, and that is not a good sign. If you can actually take the villain out of the movie and you would not need to rewrite it in any major way, and you could do that with this movie, that means there is a writing problem. You have got redundant, major components of your script are redundant. And that's not a good sign, because, as I said, this is something that has happened several times now. Age of Ultron, although I think this was a better movie than Age of Ultron, I actually think that Ultron the villain was far better, even though he's not handled very well at all. It's another example of a villain that they didn't really deliver properly. But he is much better written and more menacing, and actually does play a role that makes sense in the plot. It makes sense in the plot. If you took him out, the plot would, you'd have to rewrite someone else into it, and there'd have to be major rewrites. In this movie, there wouldn't need to be major rewrites at all, and that's a problem. It's a really glaring and very big problem. Now, I'm not very familiar with Zemo, the villain, but I understand from what I've read and what people who are really passionate fans of Marvel have told me, that he is a really interesting character with a lot of really good and amazing things they could have done with him in this movie, and they just didn't deliver at all. I was quite excited at the early stages of the movie where we were told about this army of super soldiers who are like the Winter Soldier. I thought, oh my gosh, how's this going to play out? This is going to be there's going to be a battle between these super soldiers who are invincible. The Avengers are really going to have something to battle here. This is going to draw the team together. I thought, I already, as soon as it was introduced as a concept in the movie, I started to think, how are they going to make this pay off? They didn't. They literally have Zemo shooting the other super soldiers in the head in their cryogenic frozen sleep state. They never even feature, apart from one very brief backstory shot where we go back and we are told, we're shown very briefly a scene from the past. And other than that, they don't feature. By the time the Avengers arrive on the scene where Zemo is, he's killed them all. And you realise he doesn't even need to be in this movie. It was just really, really frustrating. In fact, not only that, but his involvement in this film it's kind of like the Star Wars prequels. He's kind of like Emperor Palpatine, who carries out this really absurd and overly sort of complicated and convoluted plot to try and undo the Avengers from within. And just like the Star Wars prequels, all it would have taken is for fate to intervene at any sort of critical juncture in a very small way, and the whole thing would have unraveled. There would have been no plot. He's doing things that are really completely out of his depth. He's sort of like playing this role of the master of puppets, but there's no real reason why he should be doing that, apart from a revenge motive. But it's not like he has the qualifications or the skills to actually be this overarching master of puppets like they've sort of portrayed him in this film. And the frustrating thing, there are lots of really interesting things they could have done. He had an army of super soldiers at his disposal. He had control of the Winter Soldier. He had the ability to control him. They don't even utilize that properly. It's very briefly utilized for one scene or one set piece in the movie, and then that's it. And they don't even go back to it. It was so very frustrating. Not only that, but there are things about the plot that don't really kind of make a lot of sense when you stop and think about it. So why did he leave the Winter Soldier disguise, the mask and everything else, why did he leave that to be discovered in his hotel room? Because he deliberately set it up so that the body would be discovered, and he left the disguise with the body. Why did he do that? When you stop and think about it, having him do that actually undermines his own plot. Because if the Avengers find the mask and realise that they've been duped, and that in actual fact Captain America is right and the Winter Soldier has been framed, then there is no reason to carry on with this internal conflict. It completely undermines what he was trying to do. But the whole point of his plot, he tells us at the end, was that he was trying to tear them apart from the inside out. So why undermine that? Or potentially undermine that by leaving clear proof that there is no need for the conflict. It just didn't make a lot of sense. Another thing that was really frustrating was the villain Crossbones, who features very briefly in the beginning of this movie. And I was really frustrated by this because Crossbones is actually a pivotal character in the comic book series Captain America. And yet he is, I think, totally wasted. They use him very briefly and they quickly kill him in this film at the beginning. He is just used literally as like cannon fodder, as filler in the plot, as like an ex machina device to get them from point A to point B and to allow them to have another incident of collateral damage. But it was really frustrating because they just destroyed what I think is a really interesting villain, because they've set him up in Captain America Winter Soldier. They've given him this whole tension between him and Captain America, and it's building and building and building to the end of that film. And then he comes back in this movie and he's there for a few minutes and then they kill him. To me, that's not good writing. It's not capitalising on your strengths. It's not capitalising on what's gone before and all of the foundation and groundwork that's actually been laid for something really interesting, which would have made this movie really, really good. I mean, if this movie had been primarily about Crossbones, even working with the recruiting Zemo, and then trying to build up a secret underground network of power players to take control back of the Avengers, that would have been interesting. That would have been really, really interesting and engaging. But instead we get this villain who doesn't even need to be in this film, who is poorly written, who, if you took him out, you wouldn't even need to do any major rewriting of the script. And that is not good movie making. Another thing that really annoyed me about this film is I don't think they've actually given a very good reasons for the internal conflict that this movie presents to us, this whole civil war within the Avengers. I don't think that the motivation actually makes a lot of sense at all. If you just stop and think about this, forget about the hype for a moment, and forget about the action set pieces that were interesting and engaging and the moments of excellence in this movie, stop and think about the story, and you realize this story really hinges on a concept that makes very little sense, and in fact is really quite nonsensical when you stop and think about it. So first of all, why would collateral damage, innocent collateral civilian victims who die in the process of them saving the world from a much worse fate, why would that be such a serious problem as to cause the Avengers to completely fracture and to accept insane proposals like coming under control of the United Nations, which would actually make them very ineffective and completely slow them down as a world defence force? It wouldn't enhance them at all. It would actually undermine their ability to protect the planet. So why would they go to such drastic steps, and why would this tension and conflict arise around that with any of the Avengers when these guys have been personally involved, most of them, in these serious conflicts? They know the stakes. They know, like for example in the New York battle, they know that if they had failed, the whole world would have been subjugated, and the whole world, most human beings would have been wiped out. They would have been subjugated. It would have been the end of the planet. Same thing in Sokovia. If they'd dropped Sokovia back, it would have been this massive cataclysmic event that would have killed millions. So why then is there some conflict that's suddenly arisen around this idea that they're all getting guilt pains about the innocent collateral victims who they didn't cause, they weren't negligent, and who were the tragic victims of them trying to save the world, well, actually successfully saving the world from a far worse fate? It just doesn't make sense why they would even get upset about that. Now, the one thing that did make sense, which the movie mentions and then completely glosses over and doesn't come back to, which would have made sense as the primary motivation, was this idea that Vision introduces at one point. And he basically says, look, there seems to be a correlation between the Avengers arriving on the scene and setting themselves up and these threats to the world. So they've increased exponentially. They've just increased massively since, we, the Avengers, came on the scene. So are we actually making things worse when we think we're helping the world? Are we actually making things worse for innocent human beings who are just sort of trying to get on with their life? The old argument or debate about should you arm your police force? And if you do arm your police force, does that mean that the bad guys are going to arm themselves as well, whereas before they wouldn't? And does that mean that the bad guys are going to get bigger and more deadly weapons, and that we're going to see more innocent people caught in the crossfire? So that's the kind of debate that would make a lot of sense and I think would create tension. And all they needed to do was write in a couple of scenes where perhaps the Avengers or an Avenger or whoever had been perhaps negligent in their duty or had not done as much as they could have, or was really questioning whether they had done enough to protect innocent people. And so they really started this whole questioning about, are we actually making the world a worse place? Even though we might have saved the world, are we now actually a very serious threat because of the way that we exist? And do people see us as the vigilantes, as the sheriffs that they have to take down to prove themselves? Is this how the bad guys see us? So that would have been a really interesting concept, and I think it would have really introduced a lot of tension into the film. And it would have made sense. It would have actually given really clear motivations for this debate and division. So you could have had Avengers who are like, yes, we are causing problems, and Avengers who were newer to the team and hadn't seen those big battles and been part of them, who were really questioning whether this was a good thing. And perhaps you could have had other Avengers who were just really gung-ho and a bit jaded and just didn't care. And so that was driving politicians to get angry and upset because they weren't being as sympathetic about the deaths as perhaps they could have been. They're being too cold and clinical. There's all these things that could have played out, but they don't, because instead they go for this whole collateral damage. We must stop the collateral damage type emphasis. Now, the problem is that the plot device they create to supposedly fix the problem of collateral damage and save innocent lives and protect innocent people is to have the Avengers surrender themselves and come under the authority of the United Nations. That doesn't make any sense. Forget about the UN. It could be any government. But how does having the Avengers submit their authority to a government or to an intergovernmental or to a global governance agency, how does that actually stop collateral damage? It doesn't. Because the next time a bad guy or a supervillain or a monster or an alien race or whatever it is turns up to threaten the world, and the UN goes, right, you've got to go and fight them, guess what? There's still going to be collateral damage. People are still going to die and are going to be caught up in that crossfire. Having the UN as your boss doesn't make that go away. So this doesn't even make any sense when you stop and think about it. This is supposed to be the primary driver for the plot, and it doesn't make sense. And all it would have taken is for someone in the Avengers to spend 30 seconds saying to the other Avengers, hey, hold on a minute, if we sign this accord, that's not actually going to prevent collateral damage in future. It's not going to stop it from happening. It's still going to happen. This doesn't make a lot of sense. Not only that, but even if we sign these accords, apart from perhaps people like Iron Man, if Iron Man surrenders access to his suit, so the UN has to give him permission and authority to put the suit on and he can't get access to it otherwise, apart from characters like that, other characters like Vision, like Captain America, the Hulk, Scarlet Witch, they're not bound by pieces of paper and agreements and laws. They don't bind them in any real way because they can simply use their powers at will and completely ignore these bits of paper that they've signed. They don't mean anything. It's completely meaningless. When you're talking about super beings willingly surrendering their power over to another government, that power only remains surrendered and under the control of that government or that national governance agency like the UN, as long as those super beings are willing to keep volunteering it. But the moment those super beings say, nah, we're going to do our own thing, there is nothing the UN can do about it. So you realise this is so pointless. And when you realise that, you realise there's no tension here anymore. And there's no real reason for this conflict. You don't even need that stuff. As another commenter pointed out, you could have just had the whole tension between Bucky and Iron Man, where Captain America wants to help his friend, but Iron Man doesn't think that's the right thing to do. That's all you needed. You didn't need all that intergovernmental agency stuff. The one thing I will say that's good about that is that actually it did allow Black Panther to be introduced in a way that was really, really well crafted and really well written. That's one of the things about this movie that is good. His backstory and introduction is actually really good and organic, and it flows out of the story, unlike Spider-Man. There's no reason for Spider-Man to be in this movie. It's great when he's there and he's good for those moments, those few brief moments when he's on screen. But when you think about it, he doesn't need to be involved in this battle, and they have completely shoehorned him into the plot. Tony Stark literally says, I've got a guy in Queens. They're about to go into this major battle. And he says, I've got a guy in Queens. I'll go and see him and get him to join us as well. And that's how they end up bringing Spider-Man. It doesn't make any sense really at all when you think about it, because Spider-Man's not necessary. This young kid who is an unproven Avenger doesn't need to be part of that team. So they've really just shoehorned him into the plot. Whereas Black Panther, it really is, he comes into the story not in some ham-fisted way. He comes into the story as a part of an organic development of the plot, and he's brought into the picture rather than sort of just forcing him into the plot in a really ex-machina kind of way. I guess my last and final criticism about the structure of this movie is I remember several months ago that we were promised that the stakes were going to be very real and very high in this movie. Interestingly, the stakes are very real in the movie Captain America Winter Soldier. It really feels real. The stakes are very clear. It's a very tight and well-written, character-driven piece. And the stakes are there. The stakes feel very real in that film, and I think that's why it is the best Marvel movie still. In this film, it just doesn't feel like there's really that much at risk. The stakes just don't feel real in this movie. And as I said, that's frustrating because I remember reading reviews where we were being told by either the studio or the creators of the movie, I can't remember which, that they were hinting at the fact, they were seriously hinting, dropping hints that there was going to be a major death in this movie and that the stakes were going to be very real. And the closest we get, obviously, is the crippling of one of the characters as a result of an accident caused by Vision. And you're kind of like, well, okay, Vision has accidentally caused this problem. Why didn't he actually quickly teleport himself over there and catch the guy? That didn't quite make a lot of sense either. But anyway, we're going to ignore these plot holes and again, instead we're just going to heap glowing praise on the movie. It's another example of where I think the critics just weren't watching properly. But anyway, let's forgive and forget that for a second. But the point is that apart from that incident of paralysis, and even then, by the end of the movie, they've completely stripped all of the tension and the stakes and the drama out of that. It's sort of back to the situation where he's clearly rehabilitating himself and Captain America has given him a piece of technology to help that process along really quickly. And so the tension is effectively stripped out of that scene. The stakes just don't feel very real. And it doesn't feel like there's really much on the line here. Like I said, Captain America Winter Soldier did this really well. And I think, I have a feeling that what happened in this movie was that they perhaps got a writing brief at the very beginning where they were told, look, Captain America Winter Soldier was amazing. Absolutely knocked it out of the park. We want more of that. So we want more Captain America Winter Soldier. And so what they did was they said, right, let's accentuate and amp up aspects of Captain America Winter Soldier, and we'll also add in a whole lot of new characters into the mix as well. And at the end of it, we'll get a really good film. It doesn't work. That really doesn't work because it's nowhere near as tight and focused a character-driven piece. The tension just often is not even present. The pacing's terrible. You get bored in places. And it just doesn't feel like the stakes are real. It just doesn't feel like there's a lot on the line in this film. They keep telling us there's a lot on the line, but it doesn't feel that way. And it doesn't matter what they're telling you and how much dramatic music you're hearing, how frenetic the choreography is, and how what the dialogue is actually saying to you. Your subconscious brain knows if the tension and the drama is not really present. It knows, it feels it in a much deeper way because of the whole way the concept and the film and the plot is put together. And if it's not put together well, it doesn't matter what you're being told at any given moment, it's not going to introduce tension that is simply missing, and it's not going to suddenly make the stakes real when they weren't before. Okay, so to wrap this up, I guess I would say that this was a frustrating experience for me. I think part of the problem here and why we are seeing critics completely overhyping this movie, it is nowhere near Marvel's best film. As I said, I don't even think it's in the top 3, and it certainly isn't the best superhero movie that we've seen in recent years. I don't think either of those things are valid claims to make about this movie. I saw another professional review the other day suggesting that it was a near-perfect film. Once again, that is simply not true. This film has some major structural and writing and character problems. It is not close to being a near-perfect film at all. That's just not a valid claim. And it's really frustrating because despite that, there are moments of excellence in this movie, and this movie does have the bones are there for a good film. There is a concept there that would be really interesting if they executed it well. If they had perhaps the United Nations with a group of shadowy operators in the background and power players trying to take control of the Avengers. That would have been an interesting plot. That would have really brought something that would have created tension. If they'd handled the villain well. If they had perhaps had more of the tone that we had when Ant-Man and Spider-Man were on screen. Now, what was really interesting about that Ant-Man scene, I said this to my brother last night after the film, was If you think about it, that particular airport fight had one of the most absurd concepts that probably I think Marvel has ever introduced in a movie to date. And that was when Ant-Man used his power, his ability to become massive, and he becomes giant Ant-Man. Now, if I tell you about a character in a movie who suddenly becomes a massive giant, and the other characters have to fight him, and he's swatting them off and everything else, you'd probably think, oh, I don't know, this sounds like a 50s B-grade movie. I think this is just not going to work. It's going to be cheesy. It's not going to work as a concept. But it does. It actually works. And they pull it off, and it works really, really well. So there are moments of brilliance within this film. There are moments of excellence in this movie. I think Spider-Man was good when he was on screen, even though he doesn't need to be there. One thing about Spider-Man, why the heck is Aunt May young? See, Aunt May, as I understand it, was always meant to be she was meant to be his guru, his sort of foil, his sounding board that he goes back to when he doesn't know. He goes back to her experience, her life experience, her wisdom. She's like the wise sage to his young, passionate superhero. But now they've got Marissa Tomei playing Aunt May, and the way they've portrayed her in this film, it just doesn't look like she is going to be the sort of character that you would want to say to Spider-Man, hey, go and get advice from Aunt May. She'll set you right. She's got lots of wisdom. And she didn't even have the life experience as a character. So I remember thinking, why the heck have they done that? I can't help but sense this was just a bit of a cash grab. You know, if we try and appeal to young males by completely changing and making Aunt May more attractive, physically attractive, then that's a winner for us monetarily wise. But I don't think it's going to be good going forward for those films, that's for sure. But Spider-Man is good when he's in the film. Ant-Man is great. Black Panther, really well introduced and an interesting new character. And he actually has a meaningful story and part to play in all of this. And as I said, the concept itself is interesting and could have been done so much better. But this movie in the end, I actually think it fails to deliver. As I said, I got even the final credit scenes in this film. Like normally they either introduce another movie or they go a bit lighthearted. But in this film, the end credit scenes, well, the first one is just an extension of the movie. It's basically a scene that could have been tacked onto the end of the movie before the credits rolled. That's literally all it is. The second one is introducing Spider-Man, but it's totally redundant because we've already had Spider-Man introduced to us. If Spider-Man hadn't appeared in this movie, that would have been interesting. Instead, we see him playing with a gadget that he's clearly been given by Tony Stark, but it's just not really that interesting. So this film just didn't work. I think they went too dark and too dour. And the other thing I think was interesting for me is a lot of the critics who I read about this, who are writing about this movie, who saw it in advance, were saying things like, this is far better than Batman v Superman, and hey, Batman v Superman, this is how you make a superhero movie. Now, I'm watching that movie last night and I'm thinking, hold on a minute, some of the very things that you criticised and attacked in Batman v Superman, not only are they present in this movie, but they're actually much worse. The villain in this movie is an absolute mess. Lex Luthor in Batman v Superman is a pretty solid villain, even if you don't like the way they characterised it and wrote it. It's solid and it's a straightforward, it makes sense. You actually need him in the plot. This villain, he's totally redundant. He's not even really a villain. He's just a dad and a husband who has been wronged. It's just terrible. There's no motivational drama involved in that at all. This movie is dark. In fact, we have a killing of Iron Man's parents that was far darker than what we saw in Batman v Superman, and people complained about the darkness of that film. All of a sudden, we've got this footage, and it's put right on screen in front of us, of Iron Man's father being violently bludgeoned to death by a Winter Soldier, and his mother, who is this sort of matriarchal, piano-playing, lovely lady who's dressed in her pearls and fine clothes, is literally strangled to death in a very brutal way right in front of us. Like now that once he grabs her throat and starts the strangulation, they cut away, but it's very brutally and it's dark. Now, I'm sorry, that was far darker, I think, than anything we saw in Batman v Superman. So I got to question why, once again, these critics were panning Batman and Superman, and then they were writing reviews telling us that apparently Captain America Winter Soldier is so majorly different that this is how we should be making our movies. In fact, I got to the end of this movie and I said to my brother and to Jace, who was with us watching the film, I said, are Marvel paying critics to write glowing reviews? I think it's probably more likely that what's actually happening is Marvel has now consumed so much of the sort of cinematic space, particularly in the action sort of fantasy genre. So Disney own Marvel and they own Star Wars, and they are the two big hot properties at the moment. And they've consumed so much of that space, and I'm sure they seem to have connections with all of the key critics and the reviewers, and they also are probably throwing the best functions and parties and events to sort of launch and promote their products. I can imagine it would be very difficult for reviewers, particularly if they rely on film criticism and writing film reviews as their primary source of income. I imagine it would be very difficult for them to actually be brutally honest, or to even perhaps admit that there are problems, because hey, the guys at Marvel are really great guys and they've done some good stuff in the past and they really look after us. You can see how that sort of relationship could end up blinding a critic a little bit and causing them not to be as honest as they should be about films. I think that's why lay criticism, unpaid criticism like this, I'm not paid, I don't do this, it's a hobby for me. I think this sort of stuff is actually kind of important because people can speak their minds. But as I said, I got to the end of that movie last night and I was like, okay, even leaving aside the fact that people's personal subjectivity colours and their personal tastes colour their reviews of films, there's just no way you can justify claiming that this is Marvel's best movie, and there's no way that you can justify claiming that this is the best superhero movie we've seen in years. Neither of those things are accurate at all, and I struggle with the claims that critics were saying this is how a movie should be made, and it's really showing Batman and Superman up, because there's a lot of issues that are similar in tonality and all sorts of stuff that are similar, and there are problems that are far worse. Batman v Superman might have a dark and serious tone, but it maintains that tone consistently throughout the movie. It doesn't keep jumping around like Captain America Civil War does. So all in all, a really disappointing and as I said, I guess dumbfounding movie experience to me. It's the first time I've got to the end of a movie. I've got to the end of the movies before and been disappointed, but I haven't got to the end of a movie before and just sort of been like, what happened? And just sort of scratching my head trying to figure it out and trying to figure out why it didn't all make sense and why this concept didn't come together and how critics could get it so badly wrong. I'd love to hear your comments and feedback though. If you've seen the movie, let me know. What do you think? Do you think I was too harsh? Do you think I've been too harsh on the critics? Maybe you agree with them. Maybe you think this is the best movie ever. Let me know. I'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily.